Have you ever looked at a massive dataset in Excel and wondered how you could turn all those rows and columns into meaningful insights quickly and efficiently? Pivot tables can help you not just summarize data, but analyze trends, track performance, and even build interactive dashboards, all without writing a single formula. In this video, we're going beyond the basics. I'm going to show you how to master pivot tables, from simple tricks to advanced features like grouping data, dynamic filtering, calculated fields, and even connecting to multiple data sources. By the end of this video, you'll have the skills to handle any data challenge with ease and impress your team with your newfound Excel expertise. So if you're ready to take your data analysis game to the next level, grab your coffee, open Excel, and let's get started. Let's start with understanding how you can create a pivot table. For this exercise, we're going to use this sales data, and the links will be in the description in case you want to download and follow along. So what we're going to do is we're going to just select anywhere in this data, and I prefer selecting on the first row and first column of the data here. Okay. And then once you've selected that, just go to Insert tab here at the top. And then within this, click on Pivot Tables. This will give you a prompt, and the first option that you see is Select Table or Range. Now, Pivot Table automatically selects the entire data range. However, in case you have some blank rows in between, this might have a problem. So before you create a pivot table, ensure that you do not have any blank columns or rows within your data. And once you've done that, just make sure that the range that it's selected automatically is correct or not. If it's not correct, then change the range manually. Although most of the times, if there are no blank rows or columns, the range selected is accurate only. Now, after this, you have a couple of other options. These are some advanced things that we will get into in a while, which is use an external data source and use workbooks data model. And the next option is choose where you want the pivot table to be placed. So once a new pivot table is created, where do you want to place that pivot table? I want the pivot table to be placed on a new worksheet, although you also have an option to place it on an existing worksheet like this and select the location. So I can just simply click here and the new pivot table will be created here. But I'm going to create it on a new worksheet. And finally, it says add this data to the data model. Again, an advanced feature. We will get back to this feature in a while. Okay. I'm going to click on OK here, and instantly using that data, we have created a pivot table. Now, once a pivot table is created, this is the structure that you see. At the left, you will see the pivot table structure. And on the right side, you'll see a panel which says pivot table fields, and you'll see all the column headers that you had in your data. And then at the bottom, you have 4 options: filter, columns, rows, and values. I'll show you examples of each one of them on how to use it. So let's say in this data, I want to see, or I want to summarize this data on the basis of country, and I want to see how much sale each country made. So for that, I'm going to drag this country column and place it inside the rows section. So if you see, it has now placed all the countries, and although our data had duplicate entries for countries here, the pivot table summarizes your data, so it does not have any duplicate values now. Okay, these are all distinct values. And then I'm going to drag this sales column and drag it inside values. So now it has automatically created a sum of sales. Although if you want, you can also have average, count, or any other aggregation methods within this. So in order to change this sum of sales, you can just click on this small arrow here, click on value field setting. And from this, you can select count, average, max, min, product, or any one number of options that you have in this entire field. For now, again, I'm going to choose sum and press OK. Now, if you see, this data has been summarized using this pivot table. And now I can easily see how much sales was done in each country. Now let's filter this data. So from this entire data set, I only want to see sales for motorcycles, and I don't want any other products here. Okay, so I'm going to add a filter. So I'm going to drag this product column and drag it inside filters. And from this, just click on this drop down and click on select multiple items. Click on all so that it deselects everything. And I'm going to select just motorcycles because that's what I want to see, and press OK. Now it has automatically filtered out all the remaining numbers and showing only the numbers or sales for motorcycles within these countries. Now let's look at one more option that we have, which is columns. Let's bifurcate this number on the basis of the status of shipment. So if you see, we have a column called status, and it's in this column we have shipped, or we have in transit, or processing, right? So we have a couple of options here. So we have to bifurcate or split the data based on that. And I want that field to be placed inside columns. So I'm going to click on status here and place the status inside columns, and automatically it has split the data based on in transit and shipped. Now there are other statuses as well. The reason it's not showing up here is because for motorcycles we only have in transit or shipped. Let's see if we see other statuses. If we select all from here, press OK, and now I see we have in transit, processing, and shipped. And then at the end we also have a grand total. Now in the right panel here, there's one more option, which is this gear icon. This simply helps you choose the layout of your pivot table. So right now it says field section and area selected stacked. I can also have this pivot field section in a side-by-side fashion like this, or else I can also say fields only, and I can say only area sections. Okay, but I like this stacked structure more, so I'm going to select this only. And the last option in this panel is default layout. Now what this does is it helps you manage your memory within your system. So let's say you have a very heavy pivot table and you do not want your pivot table to update every time you make a change. So you click on this default layout update, and then let's say I add another column inside the value section here. But if you notice, the value did not get added here. That's because we have enabled this default layout. Now, in order for you to see that new change that you did in your pivot table, you just have to click on update, and then the quantity will also get added to the value section. But since our data is not that heavy, I'm not gonna enable this. If you notice now, if I make any change, the change will be reflected instantly. Okay. This is just a way of managing your system memory and ensuring that pivot table is not refreshed if it has very heavy data in it. So now that we have created a pivot table and started analyzing data, it's time to talk about formatting. But why? Because a well-formatted pivot table isn't just easier to read, it's more professional and makes your insights stand out. Formatting isn't just about making things look pretty. It's about clarity, readability, and highlighting the key information that matters to your audience. So let's dive into some essential formatting tips to take your pivot tables to the next level. The moment you create a pivot table, you will see that there are two new tabs added at the top, and you will only be able to see this when you have selected a pivot table. So if I selected outside somewhere, you would not see those two tabs. So I'm going to select the pivot table again, and now you see that within them you see a tab which is design. Now within this there are many options, but let's start with layout. This is your pivot table, and I'm going to add a new attribute inside row. So along with country, I'm going to add city as well. Okay. Now if you see, the moment I added this, the pivot table is showing in this format. Let's say I want this pivot table in a tabular format. So what will I do? What I can do is I can go to this report layout and click on show in tabular form. Now if you see, earlier everything was clubbed into one column. Now it has segregated both country and city in different columns here, right? Let me show that again. I'm going to go back to compact form, which was there earlier. It was like this. Now if I click on tabular, it's going to create like this, which is both the attributes in different columns. I can also choose outline form, but I'm going to stick with tabular, which contains your subtotal and everything. Okay. Now let's say once you've selected that, you notice that in country, there are a few blank rows here, and then again you have your country total, then the next country, and so on and so forth. But the thing is, we don't want these blank rows. We want these rows to be filled in with the same country which is there at the top, right? So how do we do that? Go to report layout and just click on repeat all item labels. This will repeat every item which is there at the top for that main header. I can switch it back to blanks by clicking on do not repeat items, but I want to keep it like this only. Then let's say these subtotals, I don't want these subtotals in this, and I just want this plain grid kind of a format. So what I can do is I can click on subtotals and I can say do not show subtotals. So if you see, all the subtotals have been removed. But then when I scroll down, I see we have a grand total row here, which is a column grand total. And then we have a grand total here, which is a row grand total. I want to remove the row grand total from here. So for that, I can do is click on grand total and I can say on for only columns. And that will remove the row grand total, but the column grand total is still there. I can also say off for rows and column. That will remove both rows and column grand total. Now let's move on to pivot table style options. Now what this does is it helps you highlight certain fields or cells of your pivot table. So let's say you want to remove the highlight from this column header. So I'm going to just uncheck this column header. And if you see, the highlight has been removed. Let's check banded rows. What this does is it highlights every alternate row so that the data is easier to identify. And then we also have a banded column. Again, as the name suggests, it's highlight every other alternative column. Then let's move on to pivot table styles. And this is very interesting. So right now this pivot table is very blank. I want to color this in a very beautiful manner. When you click on this drop down here, you have light, medium and dark colors, dark themes basically, which you can apply directly to your pivot tables. So let's select any one of them from here. But then you're not limited to just these options here. What you can do is you can also create your custom pivot table styling by clicking on this button here, which says new pivot table style. And then let's rename this. And within this, let's identify each and every aspect of the pivot table that you want to format. So here you have an option to pinpoint any aspect of your pivot table and then format that specific thing. So let's say I only want to format this filter condition here, right? Which is this product. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this report filter labels format, and I want a yellow color to this. I also want a font color as red. And then let's apply this new formatting onto the filter label. Okay. Next, I also want the same thing on the filter values. So I'm going to click this format, fill as yellow, red font, but then I want it to be a bold font. Okay. And I'm going to press OK. And you can choose to alter any aspect of the pivot table. There are many options if you scroll down. I'm going to just stop right here so that you get an idea how to do it. So once you have done all the editing or formatting for each aspect of your pivot table and you're happy with it, you can just press OK. You can also check mark this option to set this style as your default pivot table style whenever you create a new pivot table. Okay. So I'm going to press OK here. And right now the style has not been applied. I'm going to click the drop down. And if you see, now you see a custom formatting here and the custom formatting has been applied. The earlier formatting from the pivot table has been removed because remember, we only applied formatting on the filter section of the pivot table, not anything else. So I'm going to go back to my earlier format. Let's say choose this one. Now let's move down and look at the pivot table itself, and we'll see that there are a couple of options within pivot table itself which you can apply as a formatting. Okay. First of all is obviously changing column order. So I can choose this country column, drag it down, and that will change the column order. Now the city is at the top level, then the country. Okay. But I'm going to change it back to that. To change it back, you can either drag country upwards or you can drag city downwards, or else you can click on this small down arrow here and then ask it to move to end or move down. Then we have some sorting options within pivot table. If I just click anywhere on the pivot table, specifically on the value section, I can just right click and then press on sort, and now it is giving me smallest to largest or largest to smallest. And then we have some other options as well. So if I click on more sort options, it will say top to bottom, left to right, smallest to largest or largest to smallest. Okay. So I'm going to keep it as smallest to largest. And if you see, the entire pivot table has been sorted on the basis of just shipped column, not on anything else. Okay. I can click on processing here, click on sort smallest to largest, and it will sort everything on processing. Now let's click on any categorical value like country or city. So I'm going to click on this city here and right click, sort. And this time, if you notice, we don't have smallest to largest or largest to smallest. We have A to Z or Z to A because these are alphabetical values. So I'm going to say A to Z. Now, if you notice, the value has been sorted, but it is sorted on the basis of just city. Okay. The country sorting still remains the same. So everything within Australia, it has been sorted A to Z. Everything within, let's say Canada, it's sorting A to Z. Okay. I'm going to reverse the sorting here, sorting Z to A. And again, the same thing happens. The country sorting has not been disturbed. But then if you want to change the country sorting as well, you can do that by clicking on country, right click, let's do it Z to A, and it has changed the sorting here. Now what's happening is country column is sorted Z to A, and within country, the city is sorted as A to Z. Let's add the grand total back here. So I'm going to click on grand total and I'm going to say on for rows and column. And now instead of just sorting by in transit, processing or shipped, I'm going to sort it by grand total itself, sort smallest to largest. So now we have applied sorting on 3 different columns. We also have some filtering options. So we have label filters, which means that this filter is getting applied on the categorical values of the pivot table. So you can just click on label filters and say contains a certain word, and this says label filter country contains, let's say I say SWE and press OK, and it has sorted just Sweden here. Similarly, I'm going to clear this filter. Now select city here, click on value filter. This time this is getting applied on the value section of the pivot table, and let's say greater than 16,000, press OK. And it has filtered everything which is greater than 16,000. I'm going to remove the filter again. Click on the drop down, click on clear filter from city. You also have an option in the value filter to get top 10 or top 100 depending on the requirement. So I'm going to say top 10. So if you want to change this, you can do it as top 20 as well, top 30, whatever you like. And then select the item. Here it's sum of sales, but in case you had multiple items, let's say return, quantity and everything, you would have all of these listed under this drop down. But because this pivot table only contains one value, sales, that's why it's showing only sum of sales. I'm going to say OK. And now it has given us top 20 values from each country. Okay. Now let's talk about formatting the values within your pivot table. Again, you select anywhere where the values are there and right click, and you see there's an option called number format. I can click here, and within this you can choose any number format. I'm going to choose this number and use 1000 separator. I don't want any decimals, so I'm going to choose 0 and press OK. Now instantly, if you see, every value which is there in your pivot table gets formatted with the format that you chose. Now let me show you one critical formatting option that is there, which might affect while creating a report for the end user. So let's say I'm going to increase the column width here, okay? And I'm going to change the filter here. Let's say motorcycle and press OK. If you see, the width that we selected has reduced back to its default size, right? It has auto fit. But then when we are designing a report, we might not actually want that. We want the formatting to remain as it is so that the structure of the report remains the same. So in order to do that, what you need to do is just right click anywhere on the pivot table, go on pivot table options, and within this you'll find this small option which says auto fit column width on update. Just uncheck this and press OK. Remember to keep this as checked, which says preserve cell formatting on update, because you do not want to change any cell formatting when the pivot table is updated. So keep this checked and press OK. Now I'm going to increase the size here and let's change the filter. And if you notice, the width is not getting changed. It's remaining the same here. Now finally, you can also apply conditional formatting on pivot tables. And this is how you apply a conditional formatting. So click anywhere on the pivot table here, okay? And then click on the home tab, and within that go to conditional formatting, and you can choose any type of condition formatting that you want, but I'm going to choose this highlight cell rules, and I'm going to say greater than, let's say 10,000. Okay. And I'm going to fill it with a yellow fill with dark yellow text and press OK. Now, because you selected only one cell and that selected cell does not contain a value greater than 10,000, that's why we did not see that conditional formatting coming into effect. However, right after you apply condition formatting, this small square box will appear, right? If you click here, it will give you three options: selected cells, all cells showing sum of sales value, because we have selected sum of sales in the metric section here, right? And then all cells showing sum of sales value for city and status. Okay. So I'm going to choose each one of them and show you what this means. So all cells showing sum of sales value. What this is doing is wherever we have some kind of value in sum of sales and is greater than 10,000, it's highlighting that value. Now let's look at the third option, which is all cells showing sum of sales values for city and status. This means the grand total column will not be included. It will only highlight those columns where both the status column and the city column has some value in it and is greater than 10,000. Now this is one way of applying condition formatting. The second way is you can directly just select these cells, go to condition formatting, apply some kind of formatting like this. Okay. The problem with that is if I apply a filter, let's say I'm going to select a country here, UK. If you notice, because the cell moved, now we no longer are able to see the condition formatting which we applied on grand total column, because the formatting that we applied was in column F, and when the pivot table reduced its size and the grand total moved to column D, the formatting did not carry forward. However, the formatting that we applied earlier, which was there on the city and the status column, is still there, even if it has moved. Now, one more thing that I would like to mention in conditional formatting is when you're using a formula. Okay, I just want to quickly show you how you can apply a formula in conditional formatting within a pivot table or in journal as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these columns here, right, and go to conditional formatting and then create a new rule here. Within this, I'm going to select use a formula to determine which cell to format. Now within the formula, I'm going to select this one cell here. Okay. Now remember, before coming here, I've selected all the cells. Okay. That is important because that determines where the rule applies to. If you see at the top, it says F6 to F50. Okay. Now I've selected just one cell and I'm going to say greater than 10,000 format, and let's fill it with a different color this time. Press OK. Now when I press OK here, the formatting will not get applied. Okay. I'm going to press OK. The reason is I'm going to go back to conditional formatting, manage rules, and this condition that we have applied, I'm going to edit this rule. And the reason why it did not get applied is because although the formatting is getting applied on all the cells here, but the formula that we determined was $F$6, which means the entire reference is absolute. It will not change. Now, because we want the Excel to check one cell at a time to check the condition formatting, and when it moves from this cell to this cell, we want it to refer to F7 instead of F6. So if we make this absolute, that will not work. So I'm going to remove this $sign from here and press OK. And now press OK. Now if you see, the formatting has been applied. All right. So now using the same data, let's create a new pivot table on a new sheet. Okay. So I'm going to select anywhere on the data. I prefer to select on the first row and first column, and then go to insert and click on pivot table. Alternatively, you can also use a keyboard shortcut, which is Alt D and P, which opens up this prompt, and then you can just click on next. It will automatically select the data range if there are no blank rows or column in your data, and then click on next. This is just a prompt to save the memory because we are using the same data creating a duplicate pivot table. That's why it's asking for this prompt. You can just say yes here and then next. And then in this prompt, just say existing worksheet, click on this arrow icon here and go to intermediate page, click anywhere on the cell and then click on finish. This will create your new pivot table. Okay. Now, up until now, we were discussing and we've seen features that you had in your design tab of your pivot table. But now let's see what all options do we have in the pivot table analyze tab. The first feature that I would like to mention is obviously this refresh button. You've already seen this in action. Basically, if you update anything in your data, you can just click on refresh or refresh all. This will refresh your pivot table. You also have a change data source. So if I click on this, it will re-prompt you to select your data set. So in case you have an addition of column or you want to reduce the number of rows or columns in your data range, you can do that using this prompt. However, right now the data selection is accurate for us and we're going to keep it as it is. So I'm going to click on cancel. Now in this, I'm going to put in some values. Let's put in country here and let's put in sales here. I'm also going to put in quantity and returns. Now let's talk about summarization. Pivot table by default, when you drag in any column into this value section here, it will assign it an aggregation of sum if it's a numerical column. If it's a categorical column, then it will assign an aggregation of count. Okay. Now in this case, we have dragged in sales, quantity and return. All of them are numerical column. That's why we see sum of sales, sum of quantity and sum of returns. Let's say I drag in this status column. Now because this was a categorical column, that's why automatically we have a count of status, not sum. Okay, which makes sense. I'm going to remove this. If you want to remove this, you can just drag it back here, or you can just click on this drop down here and click on remove field. Now, in case you want to change the aggregation type of your column, you can easily do that. Click on this drop down and let's say I want to change the sum of sales to average of sales. So to do that, just go to this value field setting here. And within this, you'll see that summarize value by, and then within this, you can see average here. You also see count, max, min, product, count numbers, standard deviation, and many others, right? But now we just want average and you can press OK. Now I would like to mention at this stage, when I click on this value field setting here, you can also click on number format and then format that particular column. So let's say I want this value to have 1000 separators and no decimal values, and you can click OK and OK, and this will be applied here in the entire column. Now similarly, in the same drop down, I'm going to click on this drop down for returns, click on value field settings, and now go on to the second tab, which is show value as. Okay. Now this is very interesting feature because in this, you're able to convert your number into multiple different percentage values. So let's say I want the percentage of each country for returns in comparison with the grand total. Okay. So for that, I'm going to simply click on this drop down and I'm going to say percentage of grand total and press OK. Now this will show me that Australia had 4.16% returns out of total and USA had 39% returns out of total. So this is a very good way to generate insights from your data. Now within show value as, you have many other options, like for example, percentage of column total, percentage of row total, percentage of parent row total. So let me give you an example of this. So I'm going to add one more column into the row section here. Okay. So now every country has all the products which have been sold within them. Now what I'm going to do is in the quantity, I'm going to click on the drop down value setting, show value as, and I'm going to click on percentage of parent row total. Okay. And OK. Now if you see, it is showing within Australia, classic cars had the maximum number of quantities which was sold. And in total, if I just sum all these up, you will get 100%, which you can see at the bottom. Okay, so now let's look at two very important features which we have within the pivot table analyze tab here. Okay, and that is calculated fields and calculated items. And we're going to see examples of each one of them so that you understand when and why we use them. Let's start with calculated fields. I'm going to go back to this data again. And within this data, if you notice, we have a quantity column, price per unit, sales, and then returns. But if you observe closely, this sales is actually simply a multiplication of quantity with your price per unit. Okay, I can show you with an example. So if I just multiply this with this, you will get this exact same number, which means this sales number is the gross sales. This does not include the fact that there were certain returns which happened and we need to remove those returns from our final sales value. So, which means we need to calculate net sales. And this is where we will use calculated fields. In normal scenario, if you are not aware of calculated fields, the obvious answer that you would have is that you create a new column by the name net sales, and then simply, first of all, subtract the return value from the quantity value, and then multiply that number with your price per unit. That will give you your net sales. However, we can use calculated fields to do it within pivot table without consuming any further memory within our system. What we're going to do is come to this intermediate tab, and within this, I'm going to remove all these so that we can avoid any confusion. So I'm going to just keep country and the remaining columns. Now, in order to access calculated fields, just click anywhere on the pivot table. It doesn't matter whether it's a categorical column or a numerical column. Click anywhere, and then within this pivot table analyze tab, come to this field item and sets. And when you open this, you'll see this calculated fields. Click on that. Now let's name our new field. This will be net sales. And the formula is same as we demonstrated earlier, which is I'm going to open a bracket so that we follow the order of operation rules. So quantity minus returns, close the bracket so that Excel calculates this expression first, and then apply multiplication on the price per unit, and then click on add. Now, just in case after creating you realize you made some mistake, you always have an option to delete this by clicking on this, or else if you want to modify something, you can always click on this formula bar here and then modify something. Okay. Now I'm going to press OK. And if you notice, instantly we have this new column added onto our pivot. Now, because we have formatted this as a percentage, that's why it's giving us a percentage value. So what I'm going to do is just right click on this number format, number, no decimal values, use 1000 separators, and press OK. This will give you the final sales value, the net sales value for each country. And the best thing about this is I can further bifurcate if I want. So if I put in the products again into this pivot table, it will split your data based on product as well. Now let's look at calculated items. So now the scenario is in the data tab, we have so many countries listed here, right? But I have a requirement where I want to see all the countries, but all the countries which falls under European Union, I want to club it under one wing, not separate. Okay. So for example, Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, and so on. These all countries which are part of European Union should be grouped into one single header. So for this purpose, we can use calculated items. In this case, if you keep your cursor selected on numerical value of the pivot table, this will not work. And I'll show you with an example. So I've selected any numerical value here and then click on this field item. And if you see, calculated item is disabled. Okay. For this to get enabled, you need to click on the categorical column within your pivot table. In this case, the country column. Click on this drop down once more. And now the calculated item is enabled. I'm going to click on calculated items, and instantly it throws a warning saying averages, standard deviation, and variances are not supported when pivot table report has calculated items. So, which means we have to remove this average aggregation from here, and instead I'm going to use sum. Now, if I press on field items and then calculate items, it will give you this prompt. In the name section, I'm going to write European Union. If you notice, when we were creating calculated fields, it gave you column names, which we used to create a custom calculation or formula. But in this calculated items, it's giving you the field names, but then it's also giving you the items that are there within your field name. So in this case, we want to select the country column, and then we want to select all the countries which falls under EU. A plus sign because we are adding everything up. Belgium plus Denmark. Okay, so now I have added all the countries which are there in EU. I'm going to click on add. This will add the new created group into our pivot table the moment I press OK. And the remaining functionality remains the same. So you can delete this if you want. You can also modify it using this formula bar. Okay, I'm going to press OK. And if you see, a new item has been added here which says European Union. Now, by default, this does not remove the existing EU countries from this. So if you see Belgium, Denmark, Finland, everything exists here right now. But I can just manually deselect them from the pivot table, and that's it. So now we have all the countries here, and then we also have the European Union, a sum of all the countries within European Union. And as mentioned earlier, you can always go back to this, click on calculate fields, choose the field that you created, modify or delete, or just click on any categorical value here, go to calculate items, drop down, choose the new formula that you created, delete or modify whatever you want. Now, one last thing is this drop down also contains a list formula feature. So if I click on this, it will create a new sheet in your Excel file and it will list down all the formulas that you've created. This is very handy because sometimes in certain sheets, we might have inserted a lot of calculated items and fields. This helps you list down all the formulas into one sheet so that you know what you have written in terms of formulas. Pivot table also has an ability to group and segment your data, whether it's organizing dates into months and quarters, grouping products by category, or creating custom segments. Grouping allows you to make your data more meaningful and actionable. Let's see how it works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new pivot table using the same data set into a new sheet. And earlier I showed you that there's a keyboard shortcut which is Alt-D-P. But if you know that you want to create a pivot table in a new sheet, you can just extend that and write Alt-D-P and F. That will create a new pivot table inside a new sheet. Okay, so I'm going to press Alt-D-P-F and it's going to create a new pivot table onto a new sheet. Now in this, I'm going to drag this sales column in the value section. Now, if you observe, we have a date column here, which contains the individual dates when a particular sale happened. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this order date column into the row section and observe what happens. By default, the date column has been grouped automatically on the basis of year, quarter, and then months. Now you have an option to edit this grouping, because in case you don't want this grouping, you obviously would want to edit that. So what you need to do is just right click on the grouped columns here and click on group. And then this prompt will show up, which tells you on what basis this has been grouped. So I want this to be grouped on, let's say, days and not on month, quarter, and year, which means I want individual days. So I'm going to press OK. And now I have individual days like we had in our data set. Now let's go back to the grouping again. So I'm going to right click and click on group. And instead of days, I'm going to press, let's say, quarter and months and press OK. Now what we have is we have the data again segregated on the basis of quarter and then further segregated on the basis of each month. Now this is one way of grouping your data when it comes to dates. Now let's see how you can create a custom group when you have a normal text value field. So I'm going to copy paste this pivot table here. I'm going to remove this date column and I'm going to add this country column into the rows. Now, if you remember when we were doing calculated items, we created a custom item where all the countries involved in European Union was clubbed into one particular calculated item. Now we can do that with groups as well. We can create a custom group where all selected items can be part of one group. So I'm going to do that now. So I'm going to select all the countries which are there within European Union. And then after you select, and by the way you select is press Ctrl and then click. That will select multiple items. Just right click here and then press on group. And this will create a new group. You can obviously change the name of the group. So I'm going to change it by selecting this cell here. And in the formula bar here, I can just write European Union. And there you go. You have a single group which has all the EU countries listed under it. Now, this contains all the countries because if you look at the right hand side in the pivot fields, the row section has country column twice. That is because the first item here is the new country column, which contains the new group that we created. and the bottom one is the older one. Okay, so just in case you don't want the countries to be listed under your group and just want the country name and then European Union total, then what you can do is just remove the bottom one here, and this will give you just the sum of sales for the entire European Union and then remaining countries which are anyways were given earlier as well. Now let's look at another example. I'm going to copy paste this one, and now let's remove country from here, and instead of country I'm going to put in quantity, and above that I'm going to also put city, so that I know in each city what was the exact quantity of item which was sold in a given period. Now in this quantity column I'm going to right click and click on group. Now because this is a number column, it gives you a different kind of prompt, and it says starting at. Now this automatically selects the least value which was there in your data. You can obviously change it. I'm going to put it at 0, and ending at, right now it just showing the maximum value which is 85. I'm going to keep it there. And by, now this means the range of values that you want in your grouping. So I want a range of 10 numbers in a single group. So I'm going to write 10 itself and press OK. Now if you notice, it has clubbed your data, the quantity data, into ranges. So 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 59. And if you're wondering why does this start with 20 and not by 0, that is because in Allentown we don't have any orders which were less than 20. But then if you notice at the bottom in Boston we have one value which is 10 to 19. Now this feature is especially useful when you're analyzing a population demographic and you're looking at an age column and you need to create a age grouping. Now in case you don't want the grouping and you want to remove it, you can just click on the grouping, right click and click on this ungroup. That will return back to the normal state of the column that you have. And by the way, if you go to Pivot Table Analyze tab here, the options that we saw today regarding grouping are all available at the grouping section here. So you can group a selection of text like we did for European Union. You can ungroup here, and you can also use group fields on date and number columns. Now let's look at another feature within the Pivot Table Analyze tab, which is filter. Pivot Table gives you an option to insert beautiful looking slicers and timelines within your sheet, which can help you filter your data in a much more interactive way. So let me show you how it's done. So click on any pivot here and then click on Insert Slicer. It's going to ask you which column do you want to include in your filter. You can select one column or you can select multiple columns. I'm going to choose country and status and press OK. And instantly, if you notice, it created two slicers here on your sheet, and both of them are active when you select something. So I'm going to select Australia here. And if you see, the values on this pivot table changed. And if you want to remove this filter, you can just click on Clear Filters. The same applies for this slicer as well. Now, if you notice, when you're clicking this, only this pivot table value is changing. That is because this slicer is connected to just this pivot. We can connect one slicer with multiple pivot tables. The way you do that is come to Pivot Table Analyze tab, either click on Filter Connections from here, or else just click on the slicer itself, and then you'll see a slicer tab at the top, which gives you a lot of option to customize the slicer itself. Just click on Report Connections from here. And then it will show you the list of pivot tables that are available to be connected to that slicer. So right now, it's connected to Pivot Table 8. This pivot table is called Pivot Table 8, which is shown here, Pivot Table 8. And I'm going to go back to the report connections. You can add it to 6 and 5 as well. And I'm going to press OK. And if I show you, 6 and 5 is nothing but these pivot tables, 6 and 5. Okay. So now if I click on Australia, all pivot tables are filtered. But then this one is only filtering this pivot table because we have not connected this slicer with the remaining pivot tables. Another interesting feature within pivot table filters is an ability to insert timelines. So I'm going to click on Pivot Table Analyze again, and then you have an option which says Insert Timeline. Insert Timeline will only show you columns where you have some kind of date values. So when I click on this insert timeline here, it will show you only order date, because in our data, we only have one column which has date value in it. Rest everything is either text or numbers. So I'm going to select this order date and press OK. And if you see, now it has inserted a beautiful looking timeline here. And if I select just December, this pivot table is getting filtered. But as shown earlier, the remaining pivot tables are not getting filtered because this slicer or this timeline slicer is not connected to remaining pivot tables. So again, in order for us to connect all of these, just click on report connections and select the remaining two, press OK. And now everything will be filtered based on this timeline filter selection. And similar to the slicers, timeline also has another tab which is called timeline, which will only be visible when you select that particular timeline. And within this, you have many customization features like changing of theme or changing height and width, or the way labels are presented onto the timeline. Okay, so now one final thing that I would like to show you in Pivot Table Analyze tab is pivot charts. When you click on any pivot table, in Pivot Table Analyze tab, you see this option which says pivot chart. Basically, when you click on it, it gives you all the options that you have in terms of visualization, which is directly connected to your pivot table. So let's say on this small pivot table here, I'm creating a bar chart. Okay, so I'm going to click on this bar here, and then I've chosen this bar chart here and press OK. Instantly, Excel will create a chart which is directly connected to your pivot table. Now, the benefit of this type of charts are that this chart provides me an additional filtering parameter which the user can use, which is again coming from your pivot table. So if you see, you have a product drop down here, and then you can choose any products that you want, and the chart will display that results accordingly. For a user, this is a great feature to have because end user will only see the chart at the front end, and if they have an option to filter out certain series, then it's a good value add for them. This also works the other way around. So I'm going to clear the filter from here, and in the pivot table itself, I'm going to add a status, and instantly the status filter gets added to your pivot chart as well. If you see here, now I would like to remove processing from the final chart. So I've removed it from this filter and press OK. And if you see, now it's showing you only those values where you don't have processing. And the same goes in the filter that you see in the pivot table itself. It gets applied automatically there as well. Now, similar to a normal chart, pivot chart can also be edited. So let's say if I selected this series and right click, and you wanted to add a data label. So I can add a data label from here and add data labels. Selecting these data labels gives you further options of formatting it. And for example, you can add fill colors, you can add effects, you can change certain attributes of the data label, and also you can edit the labels that are added onto the chart currently. Like for example, right now it's showing values. Instead, I can ask for it to show category name as well, although it doesn't look that good when we add that, but these options are available for you to use. You can also remove the data label. So just select the data label once, and this will select all the data labels are there, and press delete. That will remove the data label. Again, I can go to the series here, right click, add data label, and within this time I can add a data callout if you like. Although I would prefer the normal data labels because that's much more visible. The pivot chart comes with this design tab, which is slightly different than what you saw in the design tab of pivot table. In this, you have an option to change the theme of the chart. You can change how the chart layout is designed. So you have so many options here. Add any chart element using this, which we also saw in this plus icon here. You can change the chart layout if you like. And then most importantly, you can also change the chart type. Let's say, for example, you made an error while selecting the chart and now you want to change the chart. You can do that by selecting the chart and go to change chart type. And that initial prompt which you saw earlier comes back again. Now you can select any other, let's say a column chart, and press OK. And the chart type has been changed. You can also switch rows and columns within your chart. So right now the product occupies the x-axis and the sales value is in the y-axis. You can switch that by clicking on this switch row columns. And then if you see, the products are now in the legend. And the moment you change that, the pivot table has also changed the structure. But I like the earlier structure, so I'm going to click on this switch row columns again, and it's going to go back to the default position. You can also format certain aspect of the pivot chart itself instead of individual elements. So let's say, for example, I want to change the background color. You can go to this format, select the empty space within your chart, and then select shape fill and choose any color you want. You can format individual series as well, which we saw earlier. You can do it by the right side panel or at the format tab at the top. So I'm going to change the color here. Let's choose this color. Play around with all these formatting options to make your chart more aesthetically pleasing. And I would suggest that you go ahead and do that so that you get more comfortable with all these functionalities. Finally, we have reached the stage where we can talk about the advanced features of pivot table. Now, these features are very useful when you're working with data which exists outside of your workbook. So let me show you what I mean. So right now, we're going to use a new data set, and that data set is not inside this workbook. Instead, I'm going to call that data from an external Excel file. Now, this external data source can be an Excel file, can be a CSV, it can also be a SQL server, and many other data sources. I'm going to show you what I mean. So right now, if I go to insert and pivot table, it gives you an option of use an external data source, right? But if I click on it right now, it's going to ask you to choose a connection, but there is no existing connection available on this workbook right now. So we have to create that connection first. So I'm going to cancel this and then go to data. And within this, you'll see many options to import data from outside or from within table range within your worksheet. What we need is Excel workbook. So I'm going to click on this get data and from file, and there you'll see from workbook. Apart from workbooks, see text, CSV, XML, JSON, even SharePoint folder. So there are a lot of options within Excel itself which you can explore in case your data exists in an external database or a cloud platform or any other source. For now, to keep things simple, I'm gonna use this Excel workbook and click on this from workbook. Browse the file where your file exists. Now in this, we have 3 data sets that we will be importing into our Excel file. The data set contains, first of all, a normal data about chocolate sales, and then 2 other data sets related to the type of chocolate and the location where the sale happened. So we're going to import all 3 data sets into this Excel file, and then we'll move forward from there. So let me first select chocolate sales, double click on it, and it will start creating a connection between this Excel file and the source file. Within this, you will see this option which says chocolate sales. I'm going to click here. And if you have worked with any other BI tools like Power BI, you will notice that this interface is very similar. Now here we have 2 options. Either we can directly load this dataset into our workbook by clicking on this load button, or in the drop down, click on this load. But if you do that, this will create a physical data inside your workbook which stores some memory. So your workbook will get heavier if you store the entire dataset in your workbook. But since you are using an external data source, I feel that that's unnecessary. You don't need the data to be stored within your Excel sheet unless your requirement says so. So for now, what we're going to do is, instead of this load, we're going to click on load to. But before doing that, I just want to quickly show you what happens if I click on load. So I clicked on load and it's establishing that connection. And if you notice, it created a new sheet by the name chocolate sales, and the entire dataset has been imported into the workbook. But this we do not need. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to right click on this connection here. So it has created a new connection. Right click on it. And now we also have an option called load to here. So I'm going to click on load to. Now instead of a table, I'm going to click on only create connection. This will not bring the entire data. Instead, just create a live connection between your workbook and the data source. And then I'm going to click on this, add this data to the data model. I'm going to explain why we are doing this in a while. But for now, just click on this and press OK. Now it's just giving you a prompt saying that this dataset is already connected to the sheet, and this might result in the data loss from the sheet, which is okay. We are now only creating the data connection and we don't need the data actually existing in this sheet. So I'm going to press OK. And if you notice, when I click that, the data from this sheet has disappeared. I'm going to right click and delete this sheet as well because I don't need this sheet. Delete. because we already have the connection at the right hand side. Similarly, I'm going to create the connection for remaining two data sets. So finally, we have all three datasets available with us. Now the benefit of using this method is that when the dataset changes in your source file, the data gets updated here as well when you click on this refresh all button. Or else you can also enable one more feature which says whenever a workbook is opened, the connection gets automatically refreshed. You access it by right clicking on the queries and connection, go to properties. Within this, you'll see this option which says refresh data when opening the file, and then press OK. So now every time the workbook is opened, this data set or this connection is refreshed, which means if there is any data change in the source data, that change will get reflected in this connection as well. So I'm going to do the same for other two data set. We have these three dataset loaded in our query connections. We can use this connection to create a pivot table now. So go to insert, pivot table, and then in this prompt, either you can choose use an external data source, choose connection. Now the connections are visible here. But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say use this workbook's data model, because if you remember, we ticked on that option where it says include this into data model. This is where it is useful. So I'm going to use this workbook's data model to create this pivot table. And I'm going to say existing worksheet. This is fine, and press OK. Now, if you see, it has created a pivot table, and the columns which are available for us to use are columns from all three data set, not just one data. So now let us drag some columns into the pivot table from each of the table and see what happens. Okay. So I'm going to use this chocolate sales, and I'm going to drag sales ID here, which is fine. I'm going to drag chocolate ID, location ID, sales, and quantity. Okay. And let's format this pivot table a little bit. So I'm going to turn off the grand totals by clicking on this. I'm going to show it in a tabular form. I'm also going to turn off the subtotals. Okay, so here it goes. So now we have a data which says sales ID, chocolate ID, location ID, sum of sales, and sum of quantity. However, we do not know what does this 105 mean? What does this 201 mean? These are just IDs. However, we don't have the information related to these IDs in this table, which is chocolate sales. So I'm going to remove these columns from here, and instead I'm going to use chocolate info. So chocolate ID, chocolate name, type, and flavor. Now if you notice, this data set also has the chocolate ID. Along with that, we have chocolate name, type of chocolate, and the flavor as well. So this contains some categorical related information. Now this is a typical fact and dimension structure that we usually see in data warehouses, right? This is how huge data warehouses store their information in. So there would be one fact table which contains only numerical related data. And then there would be a smaller dimension table which contains further details about each of those attributes. But then how will we use this? So if I try to drag one column from chocolate sale and other from chocolate info, let's see if it works or not. So I'm going to drag chocolate ID, and I want to see what is the chocolate name for each of these IDs. So I'm going to drag this chocolate name from the chocolate info table. But instantly you see a problem here. Each of the values within the chocolate name is getting repeated again and again, which means there's a problem. And the problem is relationships. These three tables are not connected or related with each other. So how do we create those relationships? So to create your connections or relationships, click on the pivot table analyze tab, and within this click on relationships. Now because we don't have any existing relationships within table, you will find this as blank. Click on new, and in this prompt, select the main fact table, which is our chocolate sales. Select the ID which you want to use to connect or create that relationship with the other table. So I'm going to select chocolate ID here. The related table is chocolate info, and the related column primary is chocolate ID again, because both the table has that same column name, and then press OK. We're going to create one more relationship here, new. Again, the fact table, chocolate sales. This time I'm going to choose location ID. Related table is location info, and the related column primary is also location ID. Now, just to explain, these are just column keys that we are using to connect both the tables together. And I'm going to press OK and close. You can always go back to relationship and edit any relationship if you want by clicking on this edit, or you can also deactivate any relationship if you want. Now let's do the same thing which we did earlier. That is chocolate sales. I'm going to drag sales ID and chocolate ID, location ID, sales and quantity. But along with this, I'm going to drag chocolate name from chocolate info, and I'm going to drag store name and city from location info. Now if you notice, the values are not getting duplicated. Each ID is represented by its own respective names or values, and we have a single table which contains data from all three data sources clubbed into one pivot table. Isn't that amazing how powerful this can be when you are working with multiple data sources? Now you can use this pivot table to create your dashboards, charts, or any other reporting platforms. So this was the end of the course when it comes to pivot tables. I hope I was able to cover all important aspects of pivot table and guide you through the entire process. Let me know in the comment section if you want me to add something else to the course, or you want to cover something else if I have missed anything. And in case you like this content, please consider subscribing to the channel and hit that notification bell icon so that you do not miss any content that I upload. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.